and AI at the University College in London. So we are going to start with the model demonstration. From there, if you have any question, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we are going to answer it at each session. From there, we are going to move to the panel discussion, after which we are going to have a series of questions from you. Let's begin with the demonstration of the model itself. I will now hand it over to Miyaka to walk us through the transferability model. She's going to show us how the tool uses machine learning or AI to assess whether research findings can be applied in different regions and contexts. Over to you, Miyaka.
Hello, everybody. Just waiting. These are not my slides, students.
Oh, excuse me.
While we're waiting, let me just introduce myself. My name is Miyaka Kinlabel. I'm an IT professional and research assistant at eBASE Africa. And I'm going to be taking us through the model. I'm going to tell you what the model is, how it works, and some areas where we have eBASE has used this model, this powerful tool.
Okay, a few minutes, so we are waiting for this slide to be presented. Thank you.
All right, Miyaka, are we good?
Great, this is
Thank
it.
you.
Okay.
Sorry for delay.
So, no problem. So, I'm going to take us, like I already said, I'm going to take us through what the model is, how it works exactly, and how eBASE is using it in various ways. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay. Every year, we generate thousands of research findings, but they often sit. Please go back to the other side. Thank you. So every year, we generate thousands of research findings, but these research findings often sit unused, especially in low middle income countries. Please, can you go to the first slide? Especially in low middle income countries, specifically in Sub-Saharan Africa. And why is this? Because they weren't made with our context in mind. Evidence is mostly generated in high income countries because they have the resources. And as such, this evidence lacks the local perspective. And it sits in libraries and they sit behind paywalls. And the average teacher in Cameroon, for example, won't even know about the education endowment toolkit. And they won't even know that one of the education strands in the education endowment toolkit, homework, is actually 100% transferable in Cameroon's context. So this is where the whole model idea stemmed from. We wanted to know if we can predict if an intervention that works in one context will work in another context. Now, what is an intervention? Simply put, an intervention is just evidence that has been proven to work in one context. Now, why does this even matter? Why are we even doing this? There are many reasons why, but I will name three. First things first, it saves time and resources by reducing the need for duplicating research. Second thing, it reduces research waste by avoiding unworkable solutions completely. And finally, it considers the local perspective. And we're going to see all this as I'm presenting. Now, what even is this transferability model? Think of it as a decision support tool that answers one very simple but powerful question. Will this intervention work in my context? The model is built on machine learning and uses the CART algorithm to decide whether an intervention can be adopted, adapted, contextualized, and even rejected in some cases. Next slide. Now, what's the criteria for making our decisions? How do we decide whether evidence is actually transferable? So when we run the model through interventions, we get a percentage. If it is 80% or above, then we know that that evidence is transferable. But if it's between 50 to 70%, then it's transferable, but it needs some modifications. I'll take an example of the Education Endowment Funds Toolkit. The EEF has 35 education strands with 228 interventions. And one of these interventions is arts participation in classrooms. Now, arts participation in classrooms, after running the model through this, we discovered that it was about 50% transferable, which means that yes, it can work in our context, but it will need some modifications. So that means that we need to provide the teachers with art supplies, or we need to, if it's arts participation with music, we need to provide them with the instruments. And finally, if the intervention is below 50%, that means we cannot use it in our context and we need to think of a new study. Next slide. Now, to power this model, we use data extracted from research papers based on PICO, and we also get input from local stakeholders. The input from the local stakeholders actually really helped us to collect data for our predictor variables. Now, what are these predictor variables? The predictor variables are the variables which we use to build our decision tree. Now, I'm going to explain each of them to everybody. First things first, the relevance. We asked the stakeholders, does the outcome address a problem that exists? Is it urgent in the local context? Is it policy relevant? Is it culturally fit? And is it feasible? And their answer was going to be a binary response of yes or no. And all this input that we took from the stakeholders was put in an Excel sheet. The second one was the complexity. How difficult would it be to implement this intervention in the local context? Now we considered all the relevant stakeholders. With something using the EEF toolkit again, we asked teachers, learners, and policymakers, and they had to define it in three ways. Either it's highly complex, medium, or low. Next slide. Now the third predictor is the cost. How costly will it be to implement the intervention in the local context? Using the EEF again, one of their strands is distance learning. How costly will it be to implement that intervention in Cameroon? So with distance learning, you will see that you will need to provide things like internet, you will need to provide things like laptops for the students so they can actually learn from outside the classroom. So again, the stakeholders were asked and they had to rate it as high, medium, or low. Now, when it comes to the importance, this one we used a scale. On a scale of 0 to 10, how do the stakeholders rate the importance of this outcome? And we scored differently for each type of stakeholder. And finally, the impact. This was ascertained by looking at the effect size. So if the effect size is less than 0.2, then it's a low impact intervention. But if it's between 0.2 to 0.45, then it's moderate. And finally, if it's higher than 0.45, then we say it's a high impact intervention. Next slide. Now, this is an example of after collecting the data from the stakeholders, we input it in the Excel sheet. So as you can see, arts participation on the second row, its relevance is yes, the complexity is low, the cost is low, the average importance is 7. Now, how do we get these values if we ask so many stakeholders? We use an average. So we got an average of the answers from the stakeholders, and we were able to get the final answer. And finally, we're able to predict the transferability. But I've not gotten to the part of us predicting the transferability yet, so hold on to your horses. Next slide. Now, if you've been a bit confused, don't worry, because now I'm going to actually explain how the model works. So once we've collected all the variables and the stakeholder scores, we use the CART model now to build a decision tree to predict the transferability. Now, because our target variable transferability is categorical, we use classification tree specifically. The first step is getting the Gini index for each of the predictor variables I mentioned before. That's relevance, cost, complexity, impact. Now, the Gini index tells us how pure a node in a tree is. And the lower the Gini index, the higher the decision power of the variable. Next slide. So on this slide, you will see that relevance has the lowest Gini index and impact has the highest Gini index. Relevance having the lowest Gini index tells us that relevance has to be the root node at the tree. And that also tells us that if an intervention is not relevant, that means we cannot even continue to build the tree. And so the intervention is deemed not transferable. We can see the cost and we can see the average importance as well. Next slide. After we have calculated the Gini index, we now have to generate or build our tree. The data set is split based on the variable thresholds. So looking at something like cost, we ask ourselves, is the cost high? Is it low? Is it medium? And then we make a decision and we check the next node. And then finally, we split until the best classification is achieved and we come to a final verdict on whether the intervention is transferable or not. And after we have generated our tree, we need to prune it and shape overfitting branches so that we can improve accuracy and we can keep the model fast and simple and generalizable. Next slide. So this is how decision making goes on with the CART algorithm. Remember that relevance is our root node. So starting from here already tells us that the intervention is relevant. So after we check the relevance, we check the cost. If the intervention is if it's high cost, then it's going to be a no, and the tree is going to break here. But if it is a low cost or a medium cost, then we can check for the impact. Now, if it's a low impact intervention, then it's going to be no, and we can see the decision. But if it is a medium or high impact intervention, then we can come to a final verdict. Moving on to the side of complexity, if it is a highly complex intervention, we can already break the tree. But if it is a low or medium complex intervention, then we can check the impact. And finally, we ask ourselves if it is a low impact or a medium impact, then we cannot have it, it's not transferable. Else, if it's high impact, then we can use it and it is transferable. Next slide, please. So now that we know how the model works, I'm going to walk us through some ways in which eBASE has applied this model. So first things first, we use the model on the EEF toolkit. The EEF toolkit has 35 education strands across 228 interventions. And our goal was to predict which interventions are transferable in Sub-Saharan Africa, and also to predict if the entire toolkit is transferable in Sub-Saharan Africa. Next slide. So you can see here, these are the toolkits and the number of interventions per strand. So we add participation, we have 7 different strands. So these are things like learning with music, learning with crafts, learning with painting. We have distance learning that has 42 different strands. So we have summer schools as well that has 5 different strands. So that's to give you an idea of how the strands are. So we ran the model on each and every one of the strands, and then we got a percentage. And then finally, we had to get a final percentage of the interventions that were transferable. Next slide. Next, okay. And these were our results. Found out that over 80%, 86.76% of the interventions were transferable. And this shows us that evidence can be localized if you ask the right questions. if you use the transferability model. So from now, we also found out that distance learning was the most transferable strand, and other strands like homework are proven to work very well in our context. Next slide. Now, the model is also being used within DEST tools. Destiny is an ecosystem of AI tools designed to accelerate evidence use in health and climate, and is applied directly to research papers. So within DEST, a transferability model is integrated into the will be integrated into the workflow, so that when a user opens a research paper, the system immediately tells them whether that intervention described is likely to work in their own context. And we're doing this using large language models like GPT-4 or to analyze the full text, and then it automatically predicts whether the paper's recommendations are actually transferable in our context. And this not only helps with faster decisions, but it also supports living evidence, because the model can be rerun anytime new data or local data changes. Next slide. So this is just a screenshot from where the model is now within DEST. So this is a research relevance elevator. And if you remember, relevance is the root node. So we want to even find out if the intervention is relevant. So what this does is you put in the title of the paper, you put in the abstract, you put in the publication here, and you get an assessment. Next slide. Now the relevance itself has its own variables that determine, for each country, that determine whether an intervention is relevant. It has problem alignment, policy alignment, cultural fit, delivery feasibility, crisis relevance, local evidence. So when you run it through this tool, it gives you a justification as to why it is like for this particular example, it's not relevant. So it gives you a whole justification here, which is really great. Next slide. Now, why is this a game changer? I'm sure you can already tell why it's a game changer, but this model is adaptable. It works beyond education, can predict transferability in health. We also use this on a paper on semaglutide for type 2 diabetes to find out whether that intervention, that drug, can work in Cameroon's context. And we actually found out that it's 80% transferable, which means that the evidence works in Cameroon's context. It also helps in policy making, so policymakers can do data-driven decisions. This model supports living evidence, because when new evidence comes out, or local data or local needs change, you can rerun the model and you still see, and you'll be updated. For policymakers, it also ensures data-driven decisions. And finally, for educators, it identifies effective teaching tools. This way, the teacher in Cameroon that didn't know about the EAF toolkit will know that homework works in Cameroon, distance learning works in Cameroon, arts participation might not work in Cameroon. And finally, for researchers, it strengthens local evidence generation. Thank you. Next slide. Thank you for listening. I hope we are all able to have an idea of what the model does, and you can leave me some questions about the model.
Thank you so much, Miyaka, for that insightful demonstration. It's quite exciting to see how machine learning can support faster, more localized decision-making by assessing the transferability of evidence. So we are going to take 2 urgent questions. So if anybody have any urgent questions, you can feel free to drop it in the chat group, or you can raise your hand based on the presentation. Thank you. Okay, so if there's no question, we are going to move right away to our panel discussion today. We are going to move. We are going to be talking about the real-world challenges opportunities and innovations in making evidence work across contexts. Our first panelist of today is Gloria. Gloria is a core researcher at eBASE Africa. Gloria is one of the core researchers behind the transferability model and has played a key role in its development. So Gloria, as a core developer, what were some of the key decisions or insights that shaped the creation of this model? And what does the model reveal about the complexity of transferring evidence across diverse settings? Over to you, Gloria.
Thank you very much. Oh, sorry about that. Thank you very much, Grafland. And well, so I think to answer your question, there are a lot of factors, but I might just touch base on the highlights that really provided a lot of insight to developing this model. And so first of all, is the gap in evidence across different settings or contexts. And if we want to sample Sub-Saharan Africa, which was our setting, you will see that, I think Miyaka already mentioned most of it. You will see that research or evidence generation in this part of the world, it's a bit slow, or it's inadequate to really guide and inform decision making for policymakers. And it's quite important to note that decision making is a process that cannot wait. We have to improvise a strategy to fill in that gap. So that's where eBASE comes in, looking at strategies, because we believe that it's our role and functionality to go out there, look for evidence, generate evidence, and bring to these policymakers to guide and inform them on how they can proceed in decision making. So that said, it makes us understand that relying or using global evidence that has been proven or tested to work best in other settings is unavoidable. So we can only use that until we see that we are at a point where the evidence that we have is quite enough to really guide or inform policymakers. Or the evidence, I think Miyaka already also mentioned that we already have a lot of data, but sometimes this data is unexploited. And it might be unexploited because it's not published out there. We don't have access to it. So the main focus that gave us a background on thinking on how we can fill this gap to inform policymakers is using evidence that has been tested to work in other settings and see if we bring that evidence to our local setting, or not even local, to other settings like SA, is it going to work? And until we actually go into a testing mode or develop a structure, we would not actually know the answer to that question. So the first thing first is the gaps in evidence across different contexts. And I think Miyaka has already talked a lot on the EEF toolkit, and you'll see that this is a very powerful toolkit that has high quality evidence, and we can see the outcome and effect from the toolkit that has been highly productive in other settings. So now it gives us that question to ask if we actually transfer that evidence that we already have knowledge about it, that it has been proven to work, because at the end of the day, going back to the setting where we want to work on SA, Sub-Saharan Africa, where we have, inadequate resources. So we want to make sure that we are maximizing what we have and avoid wastage and time as well. So that high quality evidence that has been tested in other settings and worked and was highly productive, if we transfer it to SA, is it going to give us similar results? Will the results be constant? Would there be a similarity in the output or effect? So all those questions in mind really guided the brains behind developing this model. And oftentimes we'll see that when it comes to improving outcomes in many domains, even in SA, we always know how to arrive sometimes at results, but we don't have a structure. So we want to lay down a a transfer approach or a structure based on many other factors like data triangulation, which we have been working on this model. So data triangulation in, let's say, in 3 parts. So the first part is we have the evidence that is already existing and we want to test it, we want to bring it to another setting and see if it's going to work. So what is that structure that we want to build and put it out there that, okay, if you have, be it what context or be it what domain, it can be in health, it can be in education, it can be in any other thing. So if you want to actually test if this can be transferable, what structure do you have out there? So we actually did a lot of research. We don't have a lot of structure. So we want to lay down that foundation structure for a transfer approach, which would be based on data triangulation. If you have the evidence ready or you want to do your data extraction, you want to do evidence review, what do you need? Okay, like for example, you need to maybe do stakeholders consultation of local stakeholders or policymakers or decision makers. You want to actually move from there now to, like we know right now, AI, Miyaka is stuck on Destiny tool. AI is here to stay. Whether we like it or not, it's not going anytime soon. So we want that structure on having the data there, having a stakeholders consultation, and modeling or onboarding that data into machine learning. And our core onboarding on machine learning behind this tool has been the CAT model and the Destiny tool that we're actually working on, which is comprises many other AI tools and all that. So another factor was actually like when we used the EF toolkit that had 35 strands with 228 interventions across all those strands. We want to pilot, we want to set out or encourage, especially in SA where we are still a little bit behind, using AI or embedding AI into many programs of today. So we want to test and see how that EF toolkit, its usability and effectiveness will actually work on machine learning. That's where we use the CAD model. And it comes in different aspects, which Miyaka already talked on, adopting, if we are going to use any evidence or we are using any intervention, are we going to change anything or are we going to leave it as it is? So if we are not changing anything, we are adopting that intervention. And if we have to maybe modify, so now we are adapting it or maybe adapting it to context. So I can go on and on. There are so many factors, but maybe just for time, yeah, those are the key factors that really shaped the minds behind this tool to see why we need a transferable tool out there that can be used or can be dynamic in various contexts or in other aspects like education, health, and whatever you can name it. And you asked the second question on complexity. So what's the complexity that we actually, let's say, notice behind this model? To be honest with you, I would say first was the dynamic relationship from context to context. So, and this dynamic relationship was just surrounding about resource allocation, um, endowment, resource allocation and endowment and the interest. So we have interventions that are really relevant and we think that if we actually bring it to our context, it will really improve our outcomes. But its complexity and the cost of implementing it or the cost of implementation. So those are the complex world problems that we face a lot in SSA, Sub-Saharan Africa, where we have limited resources. We have to really make sure that we are maximizing those resources very well, and we are making sure that whatever we are using, we are giving out the best. So the fact that we have that problem or we have some resources, I think the interest too. So the interest maybe can be coming from maybe the policymakers. Let's just take, for example, if we look at now where even though right now the speed, I'm really excited because the speed on generating evidence in Africa or LMICs is actually increasing right now than before. we'll see that, like lastly reported in 2020, the global data that we have there from Sub-Saharan Africa is just like 3.6% of the global data out there. So even though the hub, like LMIC is the hub for data, a lot of data, we still haven't exploited that data. We still haven't really generated evidence. It's getting somewhere, it's getting better, and maybe it's just based on interest. So the interest we still feel like is very low. It might be coming from decision makers, policymakers, like for example, let's say that interest, they're allocating a budget for a year and we don't have that interest into consideration on generating evidence. So other parts of the world are actually moving forward and that interest from SA to generate evidence is not actually there. So there are so many factors that really come in place and reveal the complexity of transferring global evidence that has proven to work in other contexts into SA and the factors that contributed in building this model. So that's all for now, Raffaele. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gloria. That was very insightful, especially your presentation or your explanation on the real-world constraint. Moving forward to our next panelist of today, I would like to welcome Professor James. Professor James, who leads AI and evidence synthesis at the University College in London. Professor, as someone that is deeply involved in the evidence synthesis and AI-enhanced decision tool, what insight can you share about the role of AI in supporting or complicating the transferability of research evidence? And how do you see AI shaping the future of contextual adaptation? Over to you, Professor.
Thank you. And thank you for the invitation. I hope my Zoom is working because the computer seems to be very hot and making lots of noise. And anyway, hope you can hear me okay. I think there are lots of interesting avenues we could explore. First of all, we're hoping that AI will just speed things up for us. I think that we spend so long looking for the evidence and then making sense of it and saying what's right, what's relevant and what isn't relevant, that by the time we get to sort of thinking, okay, so what does it mean and how do we use it, that everyone's so exhausted at that point that kind of gets forgotten. And actually, that's the most important part of the process. So what I'm hoping is that we can lay our hands on the evidence much more quickly now, or at least we will do once we've sort of we've moved along this sort of progression at the moment in terms of systems and infrastructure for it using AI. And then we can actually focus properly on that problem of, okay, so what, evidence was generated in this context, what does it mean in this? And so I'm really excited about the transferability toolkit because, what's showing us in one context, fine, but actually it shows us really well is actually how you can be much more formal and sort of thoughtful about that process. I mean, a lot of times people sort of see some kind of systematic review or evidence synthesis and, we've got this little diamond at the bottom of a forest plot, or we've got some statistical results. And, someone says, oh, that's a big effect, or that's a small effect, and then moves on. And actually, what the transferability toolkit shows us is actually there are a number of dimensions which we know about, which we can formally say, okay, so how do we appraise that for use of this evidence in this context? And we can be formal and systematic about it, and scientific, which is the nice thing, where we're showing our workings out. We're saying, okay, so I'm justifying the reasons that I think this is relevant here, and you can go and see. You can disagree with me on my judgments here, but actually it's clear and transparent in a way that a lot of the sort of transferability thinking currently isn't. It's all just sort of happening in people's heads, and there's no formal process. So I'm really enthusiastic about that. And I think that what this sort of case study to Cameroon shows us is also that we need to find ways of scaling some of this thinking up, which is why some of the work that Mayak has been doing, using the large language models and getting them to sort of make some of these formal assessments is really key, because then we can, as well as a publication within, this, she's mentioned the Destiny repository here, we could actually then have an assessment of its utility in different contexts. And obviously that's work in progress. We need to sort of think about how we organize that. I know and then we can get into, things like the sort of like the form and function types of discussion, where we say, okay, so we've got a particular policy or a particular approach, a particular intervention here, and it looks like this here, but actually whilst we've got an intervention that looks different over here, actually there's this, it's a different form of an intervention, but actually it's basically supplying the same function. And at the moment, all of that's very, very unsystematic, very, very sort of hand wavy, like I'm with my hands here. And I think that what's really interesting about this work is that you've got transferability analytics happening in the context where you actually are in a good position to say whether or not something is transferable. So, and I think that's the sort of thing that we need to see replicated elsewhere too, because of course you need deep contextual knowledge to understand some of the nuances. I think I'll stop at this point, but I think there's what this is pointing to is not just there's a great this is a great piece of work in and of itself, but actually it points to ways in which we might more systematically and a way that we can scale some of this up in really interesting ways in the future. So yeah, I'm excited about it.
Thank you so much, Professor. I would still like to ask you the last questions. Professor, from your view, from your own perspective, why do you think it might be necessary to contextualize evidence to suit local evidence? Or why do you think we should contextualize evidence to suit local realities? And what are some of the dangers of adopting evidence as it is without considering the specific context in which this particular evidence is going to be applied? Thank you. Over to you, Professor.
So was that a question for me or somebody else?
Yes, Professor, that was a question for you. So I was just saying in a nutshell that from your point of view, why is it necessary to contextualize evidence to suit local realities? And what are some of the dangers, in your own point of view, of adopting evidence as it is without, for example, let's say, considering the specific context in which it is going to be applied?
Sure. Okay. Sorry. I think there are sort of multiple reasons. First of all, one of the nice findings that Mayaka presented there was actually there's this sort of like almost this assumption that because evidence was generated in another context, it's somehow not relevant elsewhere. And what that analysis has showed us is that it's true up to a point, but actually there's a lot of evidence that can be transferred. And so for a start, what that opens the door for us to do is say, okay, so maybe we don't have to be so restrictive in which evidence we allow in. What we need to be doing is being formal about assessments of that evidence. And then actually there's probably quite a lot out there that we can use, so long as we're understanding, the sort of like the bounds that we need to put around it in terms of its utility in another context. So I think that's, it's a very optimistic point, because a lot of people make the point, they say, oh, well, it's generated over there, therefore it's not relevant to me at all. And actually, this is showing actually there may be lessons that we can learn from elsewhere, which is great, because then we've got some evidence to bear in mind. Okay, and so the other thing is around the sort of like, what do we expect to see type of question. And what you see with sort of evidence generated globally and elsewhere is kind of, this is what happened over there, sort of answer to a question. What happened there then in that particular context? And we've sometimes, whilst there are lessons we can draw from that, we've not necessarily got any reason to suppose that we will see the same effects here. And I think that's the bridge that considering in a formal way, transferability helps us to see, because obviously if you're planning services, you're planning programs in a particular area, and you've got to choose between this approach or that approach, if all you've got is evidence which may have applicability, but you just don't know how and you don't know what the limits are, it makes it really difficult to then sort of make the case for doing this or doing that, because you don't actually have, you don't actually have parameters around it. You don't have the bounds which that evidence will speak to. And we've done it just ourselves in our own country with sort of looking at evidence generated in one context and looking at how it might vary in different parts of the country. And you do get quite different sizes of effects and quite different predictions once you take into account the local factors. And that's really quite helpful for decision makers, obviously, because then they can say, okay, so I've now got a sort of like a reasoned rationale why I might want to go with this approach rather than that approach, because I've actually got some formal and some quite substantial evidence to base it on.
Thank you so much, Professor, for those fascinating reflections. We are going to continue with the questions and answer session. Feel free to drop your questions in the chat, and or you can raise up your hand if you want to ask a question. So in the chat, we have the first question, and the question was asked by 9, which says, how can policy makers access and use the model to make informed decisions? These questions should go either to Miaka or Mark.
Thank you, Grafland, for letting me answer this very thoughtful question from 9. 9 wishes to know how policymakers can access this model to facilitate decision making. Actually, this is a tool that we are still hoping to host on our website, and it's going to be a living tool, such that if a policymaker finds evidence that has been generated elsewhere, and they are wondering if that evidence can be applicable in their own setting, they would be able to go on our website, input the different parameters of the evidence they found, such as the Miaka talked about the different predictors of the model, the relevance, the cost, the complexity, the importance. Any policymaker, wherever in the world, will be able to, if they can key in these different predictors into the model, then the model will be able to generate and tell them if that piece of evidence is applicable where they are, irrespective of where they are in the world. But while the model is still in development, we have already written code that can perform this task in Python, in R, which are available upon request. We are glad to share those so they can get in contact with us. And there are also open source platforms where these predictions can be made. We've already demonstrated that this can be performed on XL Miner, this can be performed on 9 and other platforms too. But we'll host it on our website. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for answering that question. So we have the next question in the chat. Feel free as well to raise your hand in case you would like to ask any question. So the next question in the chat is, what are the technical or resource limitations in scaling this model across countries or sectors? What are the technical or resource limitations in scaling this model across countries or sectors?
Okay, I can take that question. I think one key limitation is computing power, especially for running large-scale models like ours that involve like natural language processing or full text research articles. You need a lot of computing power, especially if you want to run it across many countries. And in many low and middle income countries, access to that computing power is limited. Fun fact, Africa only has 3 supercomputers in the whole continent. So we need to think about investing in supercomputers in Africa, because it will really make this process faster, and we will realize the potential of this model to support real time and context sensitive decision making.
Thank you, Miaka, for answering the question. So it's clear that we need compute power in order to run this model. We have our next question, which is, does the model have the capacity to transfer recommendation from gray literature before building the decisions? Do you first decide on the quality assurance or the tool, or the tool does that itself?
Graf, let me quickly contribute here by again emphasizing what do we mean by evidence. Evidence doesn't mean that we find a single study that has made some recommendation and we want to know if that recommendation can be applied where we are. To gather evidence, we must follow a rigorous process. We must get that evidence, we must get enough evidence around that subject or around that matter. So if the evidence we are looking at is if semaglutide can be used to treat type 2 diabetes in Cameroon, we would consider so many studies on semaglutide in different parts of the world, because the process in predicting evidence transfer is that we must have sufficient data such that we have the training data and the learning data. So just some great literature that we find on the internet will not be enough. We must gather enough evidence around that subject. So we need the best piece of evidence would be randomized controlled trials, quasi-experimental and semi-quasi-experimental studies, and so on and so forth.
Thank you, Mark. We are going to take probably 2 last questions, and there's a question for you, Professor James, which says, what are some challenges in balancing deep contextual knowledge with the need for systematic, scalable approach to evidence transferability?
That's a great question. It's also probably the subject of a whole seminar or more on its own. The way that I think about, I mean, the evidence very, very broadly, and this is characterizing it, but you know, you can think about sort of like probabilities where you're sort of predicting on the basis of statistical inference that, you know, this has got more, this benefits more than harms, or this is better than this within a particular population with particular bounds on it. And then you can think about, okay, so I know that this particular intervention works because I actually understand how it works, and I know what the mechanisms are, and I pull this lever and this thing over here happens. And I think probably what a lot of the time we need to do is to be thinking, okay, so where are the points of intersection? Where can I actually get one type of evidence and one form of knowledge talking to the other? Because there's a lot of times where we understand deeply the sort of like the mechanisms or something, but we don't have the sort of like the inferential knowledge about sort of evaluations at scale. And then elsewhere, we might have some of that sort of evaluations at scale, but actually it's not quite intersecting with the approaches that we want to actually have evaluations done on. And so that there it is this tricky balance of finding those components of interventions and those, like I was talking about before in terms of form and function, where something may not look the same, but it's actually doing the same thing, and trying to sort of match them up in quite a formal way. And I think the transferability toolkit's part of doing that, but obviously we're getting into sort of intervention complexity here. And I can't resist just commenting on the previous question, because that was such an interesting one, because it's around the challenge of sort of the quality of the evidence, and what you need to look at when you're thinking about transferability, because there's obviously the constraints of the intervention or the services or the policies themselves. How applicable are they in my context? There's that. And then there's the transferability of the evaluation, which is the people in the evaluation, the way it was done, is that actually transferable to my context? And then on top of that, there's the sort of like whether or not the evaluation was actually done well, whether or not I trust it. And so there are multiple dimensions of this that we need to consider before, we would want to say, okay, yes, I'm going to trust this particular evaluation or not.
Thank you so much, Professor. So with this, that we have come to the end of our webinar. But there is one very pertinent question in the group, in the chat, sorry, that I would like us to address before we close today's webinar. The question goes by, how do we guarantee that, how do we guarantee that a transferable intervention or found to be transferable will achieve similar impact in Sub-Saharan Africa? So I don't know, Mark or Miaka, you can please go ahead.
Just to clarify, found to be transferable in what context?
Okay, so the question goes by, how do we guarantee that if an intervention is transferable, for example, how will it achieve a similar impact in Sub-Saharan Africa, for example?
There is no guarantee actually that if an intervention is transferable, it would achieve the same impact as in the original context. We must put in place all the necessary infrastructure and the structural requirements to achieve that impact. That's why interventions come with, we must make recommendations that need to be satisfied in order to achieve the required impact.
Okay, so
just to add to what Mark said, again, the model is more of a decision support tool. So it gives us values and then we can make a decision from there.
okay. Thank you, everybody who have asked the question. Thank you to our speakers and panelists, especially to Professor and Miaka and Mark, Gloria. Thank you so much for the thoughtful answers as well. It's with this that we come to the closing of today's webinar. As we wrap up, let's remember this. Making evidence useful means making it local. The transferability model doesn't just bring AI into research, it brings evidence to people who need it in ways that actually work in their own communities. Thank you so much again for joining us. Have a great day. Let's continue to work together to make research more meaningful, adaptable, and inclusive. Feel free as well to follow eBASE on our social media handles, on Facebook, on LinkedIn, on X, and as well on our website. Thank you, everybody, and goodbye for now.